everyone, looking at this second, quite difficult, but I think ultimately comprehensible excerpt from Aristotle. This is from a different work of his called The Metaphysics. We saw last time that Aristotle was dealing with the problem of infinite regress. And this is important because the problem of infinite regress is very relevant to the question of whether we can actually use our reason to learn anything, to find out anything, to know anything. And we saw generally what his solution was to this problem, the infinite regress. And that is probably, I think, the only solution. And that is that some things do not need to be demonstrated for us to recognize them to be true. These things are what could be called self-evident first principles. And the idea is that to begin demonstrating anything and to begin any inquiry, we have to presume that something is true. That is, we have to presume that we know something. Sometimes this is just done for the sake of argument, but sometimes when we're looking for new knowledge, we care about whether we know that it's actually true. We're not just presuming it to be true or taking it for granted, that we can be sure that it's true, because if we can't be sure that our starting points, let's say in a syllogism, are true, then we can't be sure that any conclusion that we make on their basis is true. So Aristotle, again, he solves this problem or presents his own solution by saying that there are some things which we know to be true without demonstration. I don't know if he's right, but that's the idea here. So let's look a little more closely at this brief excerpt. He says, evidently then it belongs to the philosopher, that is, to him who is studying the nature of all substance, and substance is being. Substance is the Greek word ousia, which really means being. The nature of all being, being itself, not this or that particular kind of thing, but things as things. Belongs to the philosopher to inquire also into the principles of syllogism. Remember, the syllogism is a little argument, and it starts with premises. And what's at issue here are the premises of any syllogism, the starting points. Can we rely on them? Can we accept as true or know to be true anything that hasn't been demonstrated? That's the problem of the regress. Aristotle thinks we can. He continues, but he who knows best about each genus, each kind, must be able to state the most certain principles of his subject, so that he whose subject is existing things, qua, as existing, must be able to state the most certain principles of all things. So if you're a philosopher and you're doing metaphysics, you're looking into being itself, you need to start somewhere in terms of a self-evident first principle. And because metaphysics is the most general of studies, it will need to be the most general, wide-reaching, most relevant self-evident first principle. He continues, this is the philosopher, and the most certain principle of all is that regarding which it is impossible to be mistaken. See, that's the idea, that some things we couldn't be mistaken about. And the idea of a self-evident first principle is it's something that we know without proof, but we couldn't possibly be mistaken. That's the idea. For such a principle must be both the best known, for all men may be mistaken about things which they do not know, and non-hypothetical. That is, a hypothetical would just be, well, let's just start here, right? Like at the end of the Meno, when Socrates says, well, let's just say hypothetically that virtue is a good. That is, he doesn't prove it. He just says, well, let's just take that for granted. Let's just hypothesize that. The kind of first principle that Aristotle is looking for would not be a hypothesis, something that may or may not be true that we're just taking for granted. It would have to be a necessary truth, something we couldn't be wrong about if we believe it. And I'm right here. And that which everyone must know who knows anything, he must already have when he comes to a special study. That phrase there is actually quite important. that which everyone must know who knows anything. That is, if we say that anybody knows anything, that the sky is blue, that Biden is president in 2024, January 2024, that a table has legs, that I am a human being. Anyone who knows anything must also know this other thing, but presuming this other thing to be true as a background assumption, let's say. Evidently, then, such a principle is the most certain of all. Which principle this is, let us proceed to say. So here it is. Here is Aristotle's candidate for the most self evident, wide reaching first principle that everyone knows to be true, everyone assumes to be true in everything that they say, yet is indemonstrable. That is, it cannot be proved because there's nothing more certain to prove it by. He says it is that the same attribute cannot, at the same time, belong and not belong to the same subject and in the same respect. It's the principle of non-contradiction. We'll talk about it in class. Basically, that the same attribute cannot at the same time belong and not belong to the same subject. So um, if I say that the moon is made out of green cheese, then I've made a certain statement. I don't know if it's true. Not true, but it could have been true. I don't know. So if I say that the moon is made out of green cheese, then I can also say that it's not made out of green cheese, if you understand what I'm saying. Principle of non-contradiction says exactly what he says there. That the same attribute, being made out of green cheese, cannot at the same time belong and not belong to the same subject. So either the moon is made out of green cheese, or the moon is not made out of green cheese, but not both. If you see what he's getting at, either God exists or God doesn't exist, but it can't be that God both exists and not exists. Either the moon is made out of green cheese or the moon is not made out of green cheese, but it can't be the case that the moon is both made out of green cheese and not made out of green cheese. It's got to be one or the other, not both. So that is Aristotle's example of how a principle that would get us out of the danger of an infinite regress, the idea that we know this to be true, the principle of non contradiction. Either something exists or it doesn't exist, but not it exists and it doesn't exist. That formal logical principle is an example, Aristotle's prime example, of a certain self evident and non demonstrable truth. He continues and says, this then is the most certain of all principles, since it answers to the definition given above. For it is impossible for anyone to believe the same thing to be and not to be, as some think Heraclitus says, who's an earlier Greek thinker. For what a man says, he does not necessarily believe, and if it is impossible that contrary attributes should belong at the same time to the same subject, and if an opinion which contradicts another is contrary to it, obviously it is impossible for the same man at the same time to believe the same thing, to be and not to be. That is, if I say that dinner is ready and dinner is not ready, there's something wrong. You detect immediately that I've contradicted myself and that I can't believe both things at the same time, nor can both things at the same time both be true. Aristotle's idea is that this is so deeply entrenched, built into our thinking, that we all know it to be true. We all rely on it every day. He says it is for this reason that all who are carrying out a demonstration reduce it to this as an ultimate belief. Like, this is the starting point of every argument, even if it's not stated, it's there. For this is naturally the starting point, even for all the other axioms. And axioms are starting points, like in mathematics. Like if we look at the beginning of Euclid's Elements, there are definitions, postulates, and axioms, things that need to be taken for granted, accepted as true before we start proving things. For example, one of Euclid's common notions or axioms is that things which are equal to the same thing are also equal to one another. Euclid is saying that that's something you have to presuppose to do geometry, and you can't prove it, but you easily accept it because you say that it couldn't not be true. I mean, yeah, it couldn't not be true. It has to be true. The last one, the whole is greater than the part. Consider any geometrical figure. What's being said there is that the whole figure is larger than or greater than any of its parts. You can't prove that, but the idea is it's intuitively obvious, it's self evident. So, what Aristotle is saying is that even more certain and even more general and even more taken for granted than these particular axioms, let's say mathematical ones, is the principle of non contradiction. That nothing would make sense if it weren't true, that the same thing can't be both true and false at the same time. So he has an interesting way of, I don't know about proving it. It goes on for some time. I just gave you a short excerpt, but I wanted to share you this one section where he says here in the beginning of part four, there are some who, as we said, both themselves assert that it is possible for the same thing to be and not to be, and say that people can judge this to be the case. And among others, many writers about nature use this language. But we have now posited that it is impossible for anything at the same time to be and not to be. And by this means have shown that this is the most indisputable of all principles. Remember, indisputable, but we haven't proven it. We're just accepting it as true, self evidently true. Some indeed demand that even this shall be demonstrated, but this they do through want of education. For not to know of what things one should demand demonstration, and of what one should not, argues want of education. Pretty amazing thing to say. That is, some things, if I say to you something simple, but maybe an observation like the Earth is the third planet from the sun in our solar system, most of us don't demand proof of that. But it's the kind of thing that you should be able to prove. Like, why should you believe that in the first place? There must be observations that it's built on. And so it's the kind of thing where, in some contexts, we'll prove that. You can prove that. If I say that Biden is president of the United States right now, most people would not dispute that, but I can prove it. Right? It's the kind of thing that you should be able to prove. If I say that the same attribute can't both belong and not belong to the same thing at the same time in the same respect, or if I say to you that the whole is greater than the part, Aristotle would say that that's the kind of thing that if you're a person of education, you know not to ask for a demonstration. You know not to ask for a proof because you recognize those sort of things as the true starting points that reason uses as a basis for finding out new things, not something which itself can be demonstrated because they can't be demonstrated because there's nothing more certain that we could use to demonstrate them. Uh, so we would again be caught in an infinite regress.